Hello, this is part 66 of our preparation for NSE4 exam Fortinet, authentication methods and active authentication. These methods that we learned are local password authentication, server-based authentication, and two-factor authentication are active authentication methods. Active authentication means that users are prompted to manually enter their login credentials before being granted access. But not all users authenticate the same way. Some users can be granted access transparently because user information is determined without asking the user to either their login credentials. This is known as passive authentication. So, active authentication, user receives a login prompt and must manually enter credentials to authenticate. Methods of remote servers such as POP3 server, LDAP, Radius server, local server, and TechX Plus server. And for passive, user does not receive a login prompt from FortiGate, and credentials are determined automatically. Method varies depending on type of authentication which is used. Passive authentication occurs with the single sign-on method for server-based password authentication. FSSO, RSSO, and NTLM. Knowledge check questions. Which firewall authentication method does FortiGate support? Local password authentication or biometric authentication? And the correct answer is local password authentication. Question 2. A remote LDAP user is trying to authenticate with a username and a password. How does FortiGate verify the login credentials? Option 1. FortiGate queries its own database for user credentials. Option 2. FortiGate sends the user-entered credentials to the remote server for verification. And the correct answer is, of course, because there is a remote LDAP user, and FortiGate sends user-entered credentials to the remote LDAP server for the verification. Question 3. When FortiGate uses a Radius server for remote authentication, which statement about Radius server is true? FortiGate must query the remote Radius server using the distinguished name DN, or Radius group memberships are provided by vendor-specific attributes VSAs configured on Radius server. And the correct answer is Radius group memberships are provided by vendor-specific attributes VSAs configured on the Radius server. Next chapter in firewall authentication is user groups. Types of user groups. FortiGate allows administrators to assign users to groups. Usually groups are used to more effectively manage individuals that have some kind of shared relationship. We might want to group employees by business area, such as finance or HR, or by employee type, such as contractors and guests. After we create user groups, we can add them to firewall policies. This allows you to control access to network resources because policy decisions are made on the group as a whole. We can define both local and remote user groups on a FortiGate device. There are 4 user group types. First, firewall. Second, guest users. Fourth type, FSSO, Fortinet single sign-on. Fourth type is RSSO, Radius single sign-on. The firewall users groups on FortiGate do not need to match any type of group that they may already exist on an external server such as LDAP server. The firewall user groups exist solely to make configuration of firewall policies easier. Most authentication types have the option to make decisions based on the individual user rather than just user groups. Guest user groups. Guest user groups are different from firewall user groups because they contain exclusively temporary guest user accounts, the whole account, not just the password. Guest user groups are most commonly used in wireless networks. Guest accounts expire after the predetermined amount of time, let's say after 1 or 2 hours. Administrators can manually create guest accounts or create many guest accounts at once using randomly generated user IDs and passwords. This reduces administrator workload for large events. Once created, we can add accounts to the guest user group and associate the group with the firewall policy. We can create guest management administrators who have access only to create and manage guest user accounts. Configuring user groups. We can configure user groups on the user groups page. User groups page is on graphical user interface. Go to user and authentication and then followed by user groups. Here we configure name, for example, training users. Configure type, is it guest, firewall, Fortinet, single sign-on, or Radius single sign-on. Then we configure members. We can add members and delete members. We must specify the user group type and add users to the group. Depending on the group we create, we require different configurations. For the firewall user group, for example, members can consist of local users, public key infrastructure peer users, and users from one or more remote authentication servers. If our remote authentication server is an LDAP server, so we can select specific LDAP groups to add our user group as defined on the LDAP server. Note that we can also select radius groups, but this requires additional configuration on our radius server and FortiGate. We can check that on knowledge base kb.fortinet.com. User groups simplify our configuration if we want to treat specific users in the same way. For example, if we want to provide the entire training department with access to the same network resources. If we want to treat all users differently, we need to add all users to firewall policies separately. Knowledge check. Which statement about guest user groups is true? Guest user group accounts are temporary. Guest user account passwords are temporary. And the correct answer is guest user group accounts are temporary. Guest accounts are most commonly used for which purposes? Options: to provide temporary visitor access to corporate network resources, or to provide temporary visitor access to wireless networks. And the correct option is option 2, to provide temporary visitor access to wireless networks. Next part will be authentication using firewall policies. Thank you for watching.